Children are free to head out for Children's Church. I know we can certainly keep Pastor Jeff in our prayers. He is out because of his back pain. I suspect that following this sermon, we will be praying even more fervently for his return. But I am blessed to have this opportunity to be here and share with you this morning. We are going to be looking at this passage from 1 Corinthians, and it was probably about 15 years ago that I took a seminary class on 1 Corinthians led by Pastor Daniel. And so I'm a bit more nervous than usual because I guarantee I do not remember what I learned 15 years ago. But we'll try and work our way through this. One of the things that I marvel at about 1 Corinthians is not just the content of this letter, but the context. When you dive in and study this letter, you discover that this is a part of a much larger and wider correspondence between Paul and the church there. In fact, Paul at one point refers to a previous letter that he has written. And so if you are in a class with Pastor Daniel, and he makes the comment, the first letter Paul wrote to the Corinthians in reference to this text, you can say, excuse me, actually, it is not the first letter that he wrote, because he says that he wrote a letter earlier. And I know I was not that kid in class because I was not that smart. But you could be a smart aleck if you know that. So there's previous letters that were written by Paul, later letters that are written by Paul. Paul makes reference to people that come from Corinth to share messages with him. And so this whole letter is part of this larger dialogue as the church works through different challenges and struggles and tries to understand who they are to be as a church and the role that they have in their community, in their world. And I think it's important for us to recognize this dialogue that's going on, that this isn't just a one-sided presentation. For us as a church, as we continue to seek to understand God's will for us and our role in the community and our role in the world, that it should be a dialogue that we are all together struggling to understand, engaging with one another, seeking God's will. That it's not something that is just bestowed on us from on high, but we need to work through this understanding of our identity and who we are and our purpose together as a church. But it was a challenge for the church in Corinth, and I suspect it would also be a challenge for us. I mean, think about Paul writing here, his desire for the church in Corinth. He says, "Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you should be in agreement, and that there should be no divisions among you, but that you should be united in the same mind and the same purpose." That kind of unity doesn't happen just by accident, right? That is something that you have to work for. It is hard to be the church. I mean, think about just your marriage relationship. Marriage is hard. And that's just trying to get along with one person in your life, right? I mean, I know for me, like, I get to share life with my favorite person in the whole world. And so maybe it's not hard for me, but I'm sure it's hard for her, right? But even like parenting, right? Kids that we're trying to raise to be just like us. Certainly that's a breeze, right? You always get along with your kids. Well, again, I do because my kids are awesome. But it's a challenge just trying to get along with this one person or just these few people to really engage and experience a sense of unity. It's hard. Imagine filling a whole room, a whole auditorium full of people with all of our differences, our different personalities, our different likes, our different gifts, our different talents, our different opinions. And to try and fulfill these words from Paul, you should be united in the same mind and the same purpose. it would take a miracle. But that is what God is calling us to do. That is what Paul is charging this church in Corinth to wrestle together, to work this out. I mean, it's for this reason when people ask me, how are things going at the church? I say, well, to be honest, it's a good struggle. I used to want to say, oh, it's great, it's fine. But I realized that the most honest response I could give was it's a good struggle. Because it's hard trying to live together in community and fulfill God's ultimate purposes for us in the world with a community of people that are so different. It's hard, it's a struggle, but it is so good. It is such a blessing to be a part of a church community, to feel like you are loved and cared for by others, to feel that sense of purpose that the world needs us, and that we can fulfill God's calling in our lives, and that good things are happening in this church community in so many different ways. But it's hard. It's a struggle. And Paul is writing this church in Corinth recognizing the struggles that they are facing. But he begins the letter with words of praise and love and hope, because good things are happening. But there is much that they still have to work on. And in this passage that we've read this morning, Paul is addressing those challenges with this central idea. That as you address all these problems and challenges and uncertainties and questions, what is central to all of this, what we all need to keep in mind, what we need to model our lives after, is the cross of Jesus Christ. The cross of Jesus Christ. But Paul acknowledges that the cross, it's foolishness to the world. Paul acknowledges that the concept of giving one's life up for others doesn't jive with the norms of our culture and our society. Paul says, listen, people, our standards should be completely different than those of the world. Maybe you've heard of this thing called the cross. The cross of Jesus Christ is not compatible with the standards of this world. It is foolishness. I have to admit, I love this rant, this candid rant by Paul that dances on the verge of heresy. He says, by the world's standards, the cross is foolishness or folly. Our modern usage of these words tends to kind of capture a cute, humorous, childish kind of connotation. But if you look at the original Greek and the words that Paul chose, it's actually the root for our word moron. He's saying it's moronic in the eyes of the world to consider what Jesus did on the cross. And when you look at how the story unfolds in the Gospels, you see that the Jews wanted a Messiah that would come and conquer the oppressive Romans, right? When Jesus started talking to his disciples about his need to suffer and die, his disciples could not wrap their heads around it. And even Peter pulled Jesus aside, said, look, that's a nice idea and all, but let me tell you how it's supposed to be done. They could not understand what Jesus was saying when he was telling them that he would suffer and he would die. And of course, the Greeks knew what it was like to start a kingdom or an empire, and it took power and authority and might and military and philosophy and higher learning. But Jesus didn't present that. You see, the Romans, when they captured Jesus and they heard that he was claiming to be king of the Jews, they tortured him. They put a robe around him and a crown of thorns, and they beat him. And it says they bowed down and they laughed at him. You see, the thing with crucifixion was that it wasn't just a tool that was used to execute someone. It was intended to humiliate that person. You see, what Jesus offered us was more than just his life. He demonstrated an incredible humility. And I believe that is what Paul is addressing here as he speaks to the church in Corinth and challenges them to address these problems and difficulties and struggles that they're going through, is that central to that effort must not only be the salvation that came through Jesus in the cross, but the example of Jesus and his suffering on the cross and the humility that he demonstrated. You see, the cross runs so contrary to the standards of our world. And Jesus, not only in his actions, but in his teachings, spoke contrary to the ways of our world. He said, "Blessed are the poor and the meek." He said, "If you want to find your life, you must lose it." He told his followers that they too must take up their cross and follow me. He taught them to love their enemies. He taught them to forgive again and again and again and again. He told them when someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. He taught them, do not judge. He taught them when you throw a party, invite people that can't pay you back. He told them, if you want to become great, you must become a servant of all. He told them, love one another as I have loved you. See, Paul in this letter to the Corinthians further emphasizes and clarifies this way of love. Have you read 1 Corinthians chapter 13? It's not intended just for marriage ceremonies. It was primarily intended for the church to understand how they were to live in relationship to one another. It goes something like this, and taking some liberties in paraphrasing. Even if we have captivating sermons, or excellent music, or far-reaching missions, or a great youth program, or the perfect staff structure, or even in-depth Bible studies, or a balanced budget, but we do not have love, we have nothing. Paul goes on to say, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, does not boast, it is not proud. Paul is describing the way of humility that was modeled by Jesus, a way of engaging with one another that is very different than the way of the world and the world's standards of behavior and success. We must learn to see through the lens of the cross. The cross is our compass and standard for living. And I know that sounds crazy. Again, so often we focus on the cross of what it means for our salvation, but it is also the way of life that we are called to. To the rest of the world, we may look like morons. But that's what we're called to. And you know, I'm okay with that. I've been there before. When I was in high school, I had a friend that called me a dork pretty frequently. And so I started feeling bad, and so I decided that dork meant dedicated, organized, resourceful, and kind. So she would call me a dork, and I'd say, thank you for calling me dedicated, organized, resourceful, and kind. She'd say, you're such a dork. And I'd say, thank you. See, after Paul goes on and on about the foolishness of the cross, he starts targeting them and recognizing they need to experience some humility. And so he says, not many of you who are wise by human standards, not many of you are influential, not many of you were of noble birth, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. We are all dependent on the love and the grace of God. And as we engage together as the church and we seek a unity that Jesus himself prayed for all of us, at the heart of it is a humility that Jesus demonstrated and modeled and taught us to follow. So when I was called to be a pastor of a small church in D.C. years ago, I was not ready. And I was certain that I'm not supposed to be a pastor. But over time, I learned to accept the role, not because I finally became what a pastor was supposed to be, but my understanding of what a pastor was changed significantly. One of the events that helped with that was I was on a vacation with the family, and I had some time out on the beach to do some reading, and I was reading this book by Henry Nouwen called Clowning in Rome. And here's the passage I read at that time. It said, "Clowns are not in the center of events. They appear between the great acts, fumble and fall, and make us smile again after the tensions created by the heroes we came to admire. The clowns don't have it together. They do not succeed in what they try to do. They are awkward, out of balance, and left-handed. They are on our side. We respond to them not with admiration, but with sympathy, not amazement, but with understanding, not with tension, but with a smile. Of the virtuosi, we say, how can they do it? Of the clowns, we say, they are like us. The clowns remind us with a tear and a smile that we share the same human weakness. Thus, it is not surprising that pastoral psychologists have found in the clown a powerful image to help us understand the role of those who choose to care and minister in contemporary society." I read this passage, I got up from my chair, and we had this folding tent, with the wire and the cloth, and I went to fold it up, and I could not get it back together. You ever done one of these things? And I'm twisting and turning, trying to get it into a spiral. More than once, it popped up and hit me in the face, and I struggled with it, and finally I just dragged it off of the beach. I can't do this. But as I did so, I thought someone was watching. Someone was laughing at me without question. But I realized in that moment, that's okay. Maybe I'm supposed to be a clown, not a high-flying trapeze artist. And maybe that's true for all of us, that we should be a community where we can engage with each other and be honest and real and admit our struggles and our hurts, and with humility seek help and support from one another. And as we do so, I believe that God will bind us together in unity. In just a moment here, we'll share the Lord's Supper. It's a practice that reflects that unity that we share together as a church. Let us do so now.